So let's get started. What is TypeScript? First of all, TypeScript is being described as a typed superset of JavaScript. So what does that mean? So every JavaScript program is a TypeScript program. So TypeScript just adds on to the JavaScript syntax and semantics, and it expands JavaScript with a typing system. TypeScript was also designed with JavaScript in mind, so it's not a new language, but it looks at JavaScript and tries to add some useful typing information that will help us developers day by day. And one of the things that I really like about TypeScript is when I compile TypeScript, I can still read the JavaScript output. It's not something that you're not familiar with. The variables are still there. All the constructs that you use are there. So it's if you read the JavaScript, it's very readable. One more thing is TypeScript is optionally typed. So that means you don't have to use types. You can if you want. So if there's some part that you're not interested in typing, you can just opt out of it. As I already said, TypeScript compiles or transpiles to JavaScript. So the output is JavaScript. And who's developing this thing? It's developed at Microsoft by Anders Heisberg. If you don't know that guy, he developed Turbo Pascal, Delphi. He was involved with C# and .NET, and now he's working on TypeScript. So that guy kind of knows what he's doing. And if you look through the issues on the TypeScript repository, you'll find his name quite often. So he's not just some guru in the back, he's writing code actually. Okay, what are the advantages of using TypeScript from like my perspective? It lets you catch different classes of errors before you even run your program. It provides typings, or the ecosystem, or the people around it provide typings for third-party libraries. There's awesome tooling. Like almost every IDE out there has some integration with TypeScript. There's type inference, so you don't have to write every type always. So like, for example, if you know Java, you have to type everything. With TypeScript, you don't have to type everything. You can type some things and it'll infer as much as it can just from a few types. Also, you can use new ECMAScript features because ECMAScript is like the base or the foundation for TypeScript. So you can use the new features, and the TypeScript compiler will transpile them for you. So if any of you is using Babel.js, or I think it's called Babel now, you know, it's in a way it's similar, but with types. TypeScript does not is like framework agnostic, which means you can use it with almost every framework you have out there. So you can use it with React, you can use it with Angular and Vue and what else you want. It usually works if you want to write JavaScript. And it's also easy to migrate a project from JavaScript to TypeScript. There's a nice migration path. Of course, there's some disadvantages. It's another compiler tool. Well, that's true, but to be honest, like everyone out there is using some kind of compiler, even if he writes just plain JavaScript. So, and sometimes the typings for third-party libraries are not as accurate as you want them to be. Usually they're open source projects, so sometimes you run into some kind of problems with them. Okay, so how do I get started with the TypeScript development? It's as easy as this. I just start a new project, install TypeScript, and then I can run the compiler. That's it. So TypeScript itself is written in TypeScript, so it's just an npm package that you can install and use and run on your node environment. Okay, let's go into some details about this language. First of all, I want to show you what optionally type means. This is a JavaScript program. We just assign 1, 2, 3 to the variable a and call the function trim on it. It's syntactically valid, but if I run it, well, I cannot call trim on a number. How does TypeScript help us with that? This is the TypeScript program. It's exactly the same. But if I run it through the compiler, it says property trim does not exist on that number. So even before I run it somewhere, the compiler already tells me A is of type number. And I haven't even specified it. I could have if I want, but I don't have to. So that's type inference. So we've already seen the type number. There's some other types too. There's basic types. There's interfaces, functions, generics, advanced types. There's enums, classes, and maybe I skipped a few of them. But I'm going to show you all of them, but enums and classes, just because those are a little more complex, and there's awesome documentation that you can read about them. What are the basic types? It's just the basic JavaScript types. There's one exception, which is any. So what's any? Any is anything.
Surprise!
Yeah. So any is, I would call it an escape hatch. If you don't know what type your variable is, you can assign it to any. But if you do that, the TypeScript compiler will not be able to help you anymore, because you can do anything with any. So it can be, well, I ran into this trap way too many times. I just said, oh, I'm just going to write any because I don't want to mess with the types and it's too complicated. And on the following line, I made some kind of mistake and it hit me at runtime. So any is dangerous sometimes. Okay, let's see some more interesting types. Interfaces. So interfaces in TypeScript, they define the shape of an object. And I personally often use them for API return types or internal types where I don't want to specify a class for them. The interesting thing about it, if I run a TypeScript interface through the TypeScript compiler, the output is empty. Because the compiler will discard all the type information, and JavaScript has no types, so an interface has nothing in JavaScript that corresponds to it. And there's one feature that's interesting: interfaces are open. What that means is I can extend an interface at any point in my program, and the compiler will pick that up. So if I have a library and the typings are not totally correct, I can just augment the interface. Or maybe if I want to access some hidden property that's not in the typings for some kind of reason, because it's some kind of framework internal thing, I can access it if I want to. So the next type we're going to cover, or let me explain this interface to you first, because there's one more feature in it. So we have an interface called user, and it has two properties of type string, name and username, and it has a property of type number. And there's a question mark here, and the question mark means then that the age property is optional. So, you know, usually in JavaScript you write dynamic code, and sometimes you add some properties and sometimes not. Well, TypeScript is accounting for that. We have optional properties. As well, we have optional arguments in functions too, and default arguments and stuff like that. So TypeScript does not force you into doing things differently than you already do in JavaScript, most of the time. Alright, the next type we're going to cover is functions. As we know, functions are a first-class citizen of JavaScript, so they're objects. We can pass them around, we can do very crazy stuff. But yeah, it's a type. So I wrote a function in TypeScript. It's called getUser. There's an argument that's called ID, and it returns a promise of type user. And it just uses the fetch API and returns a user object, probably. What's the type of this function? It's very easy. I mean, it's just a function type from string to promise of user. Now, what we've already seen here, this looks a lot like generic types. So we'll cover generics because they're very useful. I could, if I want, so we have an identity function here, and I could implement it with any. And that's okay. I mean, it works. It works. It's the same as if you know Java, I could write object everywhere I want to have a type. It works. But first of all, the type is a function type. But the thing that's a little odd about it, I can write the identity of frontend meetup.len and it'll return 15. But what happens if I write identity of frontend meetup.foo? Well, it's going to be undefined. Maybe I want this to happen, but maybe I want somebody telling me the property foo does not exist on that type. Because usually, if I write something like this, I did not intend to use a property that does not exist. And generics help us with that. I can just change the identity function to use a generic type argument t, and the type of this function is the argument is a t and it returns a t. And if I use it with the example from before, it still returns 15 for the length, but the second line, the compiler will complain about foo does not exist on type frontend meetup. So basically, foo does not exist on the type string. And, you know, I could hunt this bug for a while if it's in some place I don't hit very often. Now let's go into some more interesting types. There's something called intersection type. What does it mean? It means that I can use the intersection of two types. So here I have two interfaces, an interface named name and an interface named age, and they have a name and an age property. And I can declare a new type, person, that's the combination of those two interfaces. So I can start combining types. And that's useful in, you know, different libraries where you just say, oh, you know, I have an object somewhere and I'll just combine two objects and return them. Well, they can still be typed in TypeScript with things like this. So sometimes that's useful. Then there's another thing called union types. And that's not the combination of two things, but it's an either or. So I can declare a variable called number or string to be a string or a number. And I'm able to assign a number or a string to it, and the TypeScript compiler does not complain about it. If I start calling some properties on that variable, like for example length, I need to start using guards. I need to check for the type string before I can call length on it without the TypeScript compiler complaining about it. So it can be very helpful if sometimes I have interfaces or functions that will accept arguments of different types, and the compiler will tell me, you have to think about, is it this type or is it the other type? Oh, sorry. Okay, so that was the part about types. Of course, there's classes, there's enums, and there's also more on types. Like you can have something, you can start using unions and with discriminator properties and stuff like this, but that's a little too advanced for an introduction. So if you're interested in that, read the documentation. It's not too complicated. The specification is, but the documentation is okay. Okay. Now, usually we don't write programs that don't use any kind of libraries. Today we just go and say npm install some kind of library. And what do we do with TypeScript? How do we type it? And there's three different possibilities. We can write our own type definitions. What are type definitions? It's just files that don't contain any implementation. They just contain the specifications of the functions and types in that library. We can use the type scope from the npm registry, or if we're lucky, our library comes with type definition files that are already bundled with it. So the question was, how do I declare an object or an object structure to be read-only? There was I don't remember the release.
Yeah.
It's probably 2.4 or 2.5, I think.
Yeah.
They added something that I don't know the name of anymore.
Okay.
But so
there is something.
There's a possibility where you can say, I want I want this type or this interface to be read-only. So you can access like every property of that type and make it read-only, or you can make it optional too, and things like that. So there's support for that, but it was added recently. So like last year.
You can just use generic. It's like
No, it's not like generics. It's like generics on a type level.
yeah.
So it's different from generics.
Can't you just like grab it in the class and only have get accesses?
Yeah, but in this case it wouldn't be recursively, right? So if you
Or if your property is another object.
yeah, exactly. I will have a look at that. Thank
Yeah.
Yeah, you could actually brainstorm afterwards, so Thomas is not going to leave us. So he will stay with us and you can still have a chat about it. Any other questions? If not, then thanks a lot. It was really informative.